You might picture the Wild West full of heroic gunfights, sprawling prairies, and cowboys tipping hats, but beneath that rugged charm was a world ruled by dirt, disease, and desperation. From filthy streets filled with waste and contaminated water everyone shared, to pest-infested beds and soaps that couldn't clean anything, life was far from romantic. This is the shocking hygiene horror of the Wild West, and it was worse than you think. Let's start with one of the most shocking hygiene horrors of the Wild West, which is the widespread spitting. Spitting was everywhere in frontier towns, like bars, saloons, sidewalks, and even courtrooms. If someone had tobacco in their mouth, it was normal to spit it out in public. Chewing tobacco was common, and spitting was even more widespread. Saloons especially doubled as social hubs where patrons often spat on the floor, by the bar, or onto sawdust that covered the floor to absorb the mess. That sawdust got reused and was left to pile up, turning into a breeding ground for germs and bad smells. Spitting was so visible everywhere, and not to mention pretty gross, that towns and cities started passing rules that banned spitting in public spaces. Violators were fined and shamed, forcing them to use the designated spitting containers. Despite all these laws, hygiene was hardly saved. There was barely any implementation, and the spitting caused diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia to spread among everyone. Not to mention, the floors always smelled like old tobacco and worse. The streets in many Wild West towns were less of a dusty trail and more of mud, manure, and mayhem. Most of the roads were unpaved, so when it rained, they turned into muddy rivers, drifting into houses, saloons, and sidewalks alike. When they become dry, they kick up clouds of dust mixed with dirt and animal droppings. Horses, mules, cows, and even roaming livestock always relieved themselves in the street. When you throw in the stray dogs and cats, whatever passed for dumpsters, and lack of cleaning, all the streets were a gross scene. Who picked up the slack? Often, nobody. Small towns never budgeted for sanitation. Also, the local lawmen, marshals, or constables occasionally hired people, sometimes jail inmates or kids for a dime or two, to sweep or clear street debris. But this was sporadic, and there was no guarantee that they would actually do their job. In the Wild West, horse manure was literally everywhere. The manure was mixed with mud, and this created slipping hazards, attracted flies, raised smells, and even carried diseases. In the summer heat, the dried manure turned to dust and covered everything. Western towns looked, smelled, and felt filthy. But that wasn't all. Even the beds they slept in were pretty disgusting, and they did everything on that bed. If you think your mattress is uncomfortable, spare a thought for frontier settlers. Beds back then were less of a cozy nest and more of a ground for breeding bugs. They used straw ticks, sacks full of hay, or feather stuffing so they could have a soft bed. But all of these are great hiding places for fleas, lice, and bed bugs. Their mattress was just a bag of straw, maybe a blanket or two, but to make things worse, they hardly ever washed the blankets. They never cleaned their sheets and blankets, except when they just happened to have extra water, time, and soap. Most times, pets moved into their beds like they owned the place, like lice in hair and clothing, fleas biting at night, and bedbugs nibbling unseen under cover. Folks might wake up more itchy than rested. This left them with a lot of insects on their body. Their tubular wooden bed frames came with rope lashings or simple planks that gave bugs all kinds of crevices to hide in. Feather beds, although they were more of a luxury because they were soft, weren't actually safe. Feathers could trap heat, moisture, and bugs. Sometimes the Wild Westerns tried remedies, like putting the bed off walls, sprinkling powders like insecticidal or herbal stuff, beating out bedding, and exposing it to sun or smoke. But this could only help for a while, and it didn't help that their outhouses were particularly horrifying. It's expected that there were no modern bathrooms in the Wild West frontier towns, but what they used was part of their hygiene horrors. Outhouses were the go-to solution for anyone who wanted to relieve themselves. It was a simple wooden shed built over a pit in the ground, just far enough from the house so you could avoid the stench, but close enough that you weren't trekking miles in the dark. These structures were rudimentary. It mostly had a wooden bench with a hole, sometimes two, a larger hole for the adults and a smaller one for the kids, right over a pit. When the pit filled up or got too nasty, the folks would bury it, dig a new one nearby, and move the outhouse hut over. No fancy plumbing was required. The smell was horrible, and it was always covered with flies, bugs, and something worse. There was little ventilation or cleaning, so the odors built up pretty fast. Despite how grim and disgusting it sounds, these outhouses were a necessary evil. They offered more privacy than just go behind the bushes, and just had to suffice until better plumbing made its way to the West. But even as they used these dirty toilets all the time, there was no such thing as toilet paper. Believe it or not, having a soft roll of toilet paper by the loo was a luxury in the Wild West. Commercial toilet paper was actually invented in the mid-1800s, but no one saw it as essential in the frontier towns. So what did folks use to clean up? They got creative. They used leaves, grass, and even soft mullein plants, all favorites provided by nature. Corn cobs were another go-to because they were widely available in agricultural areas, but they were quite stiff. Other options were old newspapers, catalogs, or anything flat and somewhat pliable. And when none of that was possible, they used rags, scraps of cloth, or even bandanas, and yes, they were washed and reused. Using these alternatives wasn't exactly a spa moment for the Wild Westerners, but another hygiene routine that they completely missed out on was dental, whether it was to brush their teeth or get them cleaned. Dental care out in the West was more like dental dare. If your tooth ached in frontier towns, the most likely prescription was to hold still, grit your teeth, and ask someone to yank it out with pliers. Until the mid-1980s, extraction was pretty much the only solution. There were no real dental tools, and barbers, blacksmiths, or general store owners often played dentist, dentist's assistant, and torturer, all rolled into one. There was nothing like pain relief in the Wild West, and most people drank whiskey to endure. Sometimes there was laughing gas, or even cocaine later on, but that's only if you could pay enough. Tooth decay was rampant in the Wild West. Most people neglect their teeth with irregular brushing and consuming a lot of sugar and tobacco. Although there were toothbrushes, many people didn't bother to buy them, and when they did, some used rudimentary toothpastes like chalk, soap, and herbs, but cleaning was inconsistent and very ineffective. Dentures in the Wild West were very primitive too, often made of wood, bone, or even human teeth, in some grim and disgusting cases. Anyone who has teeth problems only gets a rough tool, a pair of pliers, and prayer. But even as their teeth and mouths were decayed, they had a dirty habit of spitting everywhere, another hygiene horror that made their towns more disgusting. There were many things that made the Wild West so dirty, but one of the main problems was their dirty water. In the Wild West, water wasn't always the clean, life-giving stuff you'd hope for. Sometimes it was more like a gamble. When you couldn't haul sparkling spring water or rainwater, you drank from creeks, rivers, and ponds, often downstream from where livestock, outhouses, or decaying carcasses had done their business. But most Wild Westerners didn't realize how risky this was. Sometimes, settlements were built upstream from their own waste pools, or worse, and this caused waste to sneak into their wells. People wouldn't know the problems until illnesses like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery showed up. The best way was to boil water, but who had time for that? Fuel was precious, and time was short, and hauling extra wood just to boil water for drinking wasn't always practical. Using cloth to pour or strain water helped a little with visible muck, but it couldn't remove the microscopic germs. Rainwater harvesting or wells were much safer when they worked properly, but the maintenance, like cleaning cisterns and sealing wells from runoff, often lagged. When seasons were dry or drought hit, it forced people to use whatever water there was. Even though the water was dirty, they still had to use it to bathe, although not all the time. In the Wild West, bathing wasn't something they did every day, but it was a rare event. Water was precious. Hauling it took effort, and heating even more so. Folks might wash up with a basin of cold water when possible, but there was nothing like a full-body bath. When a family decided to bathe, they did it together, but that was a lot of work. Everyone took turns using the same tub, and they reused the same water. After the bath, that water might be used for washing clothes or dishes. In more remote or arid places, they only had a bath once in a season, or more disgustingly, once in a year. They especially didn't bathe during the winters because they had to haul water and heat it. Rivers or creeks helped for occasional rinses or swims, but they could only do this quickly because of the cold water. Also, what counted as a bath is different from what you think now. They mostly went for a sponge down, a splash in a creek, or just rinsing off dust and sweat. By our standards, they were dirty, but to them, they were doing pretty okay, even with their very crude and not-so-clean soaps. Soaps in frontier towns were a far cry from the gently scented bars you find in fancy stores. The soap people used was crude and literally made from what they had, like rendered animal fats mixed with ash, water, and heat. There were no fancy perfumes or designer packaging. The ashes came mostly from hardwoods. Most people collected wood ashes from hearths or campfires, leached them with water to get lye, and then mixed that lye with fat. They boiled it and stirred it, and then waited for the mixture to solidify and cool down. They had soft soap for laundry or dishes and harder bars if they had stronger lye. But their type of soap was pretty rough. It was harsh on the skin, especially the delicate parts. It stripped oils, caused dryness, cracked hands, and sometimes even burned. But it cleaned well enough to handle the dust, sweat, animal grease, and whatever else they faced. But what choice did they have? Clean water was already rare, and they had no choice but to make do with something they could produce themselves. In many homesteads, soap making was a seasonal chore. After bathing, the next thing to do is to clean yourself. But the Wild Westerners had to share the same towels afterwards. Sharing the same towel might not seem like a big deal, but imagine sharing a towel that hasn't been cleaned in weeks with tens of people. Towels were hanging on a hook behind the bar or draped over rails, available for anyone who wanted to use them at the saloon. Just think about it. Someone knocks back a pint and wipes their chin, and then another person comes along, maybe with grubby fingers, wipes off a spill or cleans their boot and then hangs it back up. This happens over and over again, but the towels never get washed because laundering requires water, soap, and labor, all in short supply. Because people didn't fully understand the germ theory, these shared towels were more like tools for spreading germs. It spread skin irritation, mild infections, and other diseases, all due to the reused cloth and lack of cleaning. Another hygiene horror that the Wild West had was what they actually thought would be a hygienic move. They covered their floors with sawdust. Picture this: wood plank floorboards, spilled whiskey, beer, chewing tobacco, maybe even blood, or worse, and someone dumps a large pile of sawdust on top. This was meant to soak up the mess. Sawdust was a cheap way to clean up. Aside from hiding dirt, sawdust helped to mask smells, especially since their saloons had a lot of horrible smells like urine, vomit, and tobacco juice. It made sweeping easier. After a rowdy night, the floors would be raked or swept, and old dust with all its grime would be thrown out. But of course, this solution wasn't perfect. Sawdust could get wet and soggy and become a breeding ground for bacteria and fungus and trap all kinds of crud underneath. Once the sawdust dried, the dust spread, causing diseases to spread around. It was things like these that caused fungal, skin, and wound infections all around the Wild West. Out west, a scrape from a fence, a prick from a cactus, or a thorn in a bootleg invited all kinds of infections. They deal with dirt, sweat, and animal manure every day, and mix that with rare bathing, shabby clothes, and cruddy cleaning, and you have the perfect breeding ground for skin and fungal trouble. Fungal infections are especially nasty. Cowboys riding day in, day out, wearing damp boots and covered in dust, sweat, and road grime. This led to itching, burning, and peeling. Scratching usually made things worse, especially since they did so with their filthy fingers, and this invited bacterial infections on top of the fungal ones. Then, there were wounds like gunshots, knife cuts, livestock kicks, and splinters, and when they weren't cleaned, infection was a serious risk. Without antiseptics or knowledge of germs, people used rudimentary remedies like clean water, maybe whiskey. If an infection struck, swelling, pus, and fever could follow. Sometimes it meant permanent scarring. All of these led to rampant disease in the Wild West. Disease was an unwanted guest out west. It showed up uninvited, spread fast, and refused to leave quietly. Between poorly sanitized water supplies, crowded saloons or mining camps, and people traveling long trails carrying germs in their baggage, there was a constant threat of plague, fever, and infection. Some of the worst offenders were smallpox, which hit Native American communities hard because they had little to no immunity, and cholera due to the river or well water contamination. Wagon trains and frontier towns could see mass sickness in a matter of days. Then there was typhoid, dysentery, or even measles and influenza. This was especially dangerous for children, the elderly, or those who were dealing with a poor diet or hardship. Medical knowledge was limited, and germ theory was getting grounded. Treatments were sketchy, and hospitals or doctors were distant. By the time symptoms of many illnesses appear, lots of damage might have already been done. In the Wild West, people died far more often from disease than from gunfights, and one of the main reasons was because of their unhygienic food. Food in the Wild West wasn't exactly prepped under Michelin standards. See, most people cooked over open flames or campfires using cast iron pots and skillets that were hard to clean thoroughly. They shared tools and utensils, even when they were caked with old grease, soot, and even ashes. Preserving food was a challenge. Without refrigeration, the meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. But sometimes that wasn't enough. If meat or dairy sat too long, bacteria moved in. Sometimes they ate meat with odd smells or spoilage. Water used for cooking or rinsing was often hauled in buckets, possibly not the cleanest, but maybe collected from creeks or rivers downstream of camps or animals. Clean water, soap, and washing hands weren't priorities, so there was cross-contamination everywhere, like raw meat touching cooked food and old grease mixed with fresh. Then there's the issue of pests, like flies buzzing over open stews and rodents scavenging scraps. They didn't bother to cover their food. In the Wild West, you ate what you could and hoped you stayed healthy. Rounding up is something that most people don't think about, and that's the challenge women face in the Wild West. These women dealt with general hygiene horrors, but often with extra hurdles that made daily life tougher. For one, menstrual hygiene was a major challenge. Before disposable pads were invented in the late 1800s, women had to make do with whatever they could find, like rags, cloth scraps, and paper, if lucky. They washed and reused these, often without private facilities or clean water. Period hygiene was a bit of a thing, but there weren't enough resources to take care of it. Privacy was rarely guaranteed. Bathing options were limited, outhouses were communal and crude, and performing women's business out in the open or with makeshift coverings was common. Clothing was another issue. Gowns, long skirts, and corsets, all heavy, hard to wash, slow to dry, and prone to trapping dirt, sweat, and insects. Changing underwear or undergarments frequently was seldom possible. Pregnancy, childbirth, and female diseases added layers of risk. Medical care was far away, and there was no antiseptic knowledge, even for the midwives. Even dealing with infections after childbirth or miscarriage could be deadly. Life in the Wild West wasn't exactly a spa retreat. Imagine being surrounded by dusty plains, a blazing sun, and zero assurance that there's a clean stream nearby. Water was a luxury, and if you were lucky, there was enough in a river, pond, or seasonal creek. But if it was far away, you had to haul it over rough terrain. Homes hardly ever had wells or hand pumps until the later decades, and even then, they had to use them very carefully. Every bucket counted for cooking, drinking, and watering livestock, and so cleaning oneself, or clothes, often came last. Even when water was available, infrastructure was still in its primitive stage. There was no indoor plumbing, no sewage systems, and no running water. The toilets were basic outhouses or pits. Waste disposal was crude, and shared public spaces were rarely designed with sanitation in mind. Even the frontier towns popped up fast, mostly to support mining, railroad, or cattle, and no one was thinking about planning for hygiene. Unlike today, where we wear a mask for a little cold, medical understanding was way behind in the Wild West. Although they knew a bit about germ theory, most people didn't accept it. Many people still believed in miasma and older folk remedies. The doctors were often more of a jack-of-all-trades than experts, and they had few tools, limited supplies, and patchy training. All of these infections, diseases, wounds, germs, and dirty water came together to form a major cesspool that was the Wild West. The Wild West was filled with hygiene horrors that you wouldn't even believe. From the filthy streets filled with manure and trash to diseases and sicknesses that spread everywhere, what do you think is the scariest part of the Wild West? Let's know your thoughts in the comments. So, thanks for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.